There comes a peculiar moment in a person's life when the noise finally collapses under the weight of truth. It does not arrive with trumpets or public apologies. It comes quietly, almost shyly, like dawn creeping through a long sealed window. You do not hear it announced, yet you feel it, an unmistakable shift in the air. The same voices that once spoke with certainty now hesitate. The same eyes that once accused now avoid meeting yours. Without a single word being spoken, something undeniable has happened. The story they told about you has begun to fall apart. For a long time, you lived inside a misunderstanding that was not of your making. You were judged not by what you were, but by what was convenient for others to believe. It is a strange cruelty, this business of being innocent while wearing the costume of guilt. You learn very quickly that truth is not always welcomed at first sight. People prefer a simple villain to a complicated human being. They prefer a neat lie to a demanding truth. And so you stood there, misread, mislabeled, quietly enduring a verdict you never deserved. What few people understand is that innocence does not scream. It does not defend itself endlessly. It does not pace the courtroom of public opinion demanding fairness. Innocence waits. It waits because it has nothing to prove, only time to endure. While accusation exhausts itself through repetition, innocence remains strangely untouched, like a stone in a river that water may rush over but never carry away. And that endurance, though painful, is what slowly undoes every false narrative. At first, they were sure of themselves. Certainty is intoxicating when it feeds the ego. They spoke confidently about your intentions, your character, your supposed hidden motives. They mistook confidence for correctness. Yet certainty built on assumption is a fragile thing. It cannot survive prolonged exposure to reality. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to appear. Stories stopped lining up. Reactions no longer matched the accusations. Your silence did something their arguments could not. It forced people to observe rather than react. Time, that unromantic and relentless judge, began its quiet work. People watched you remain steady where guilt would have grown frantic. They noticed that your actions did not carry the bitterness expected of the guilty. They sensed an absence of manipulation, an absence of defense tactics, an absence of desperation. And without intending to, you began to raise questions in their minds, questions far more powerful than explanations. If they were truly at fault, people wondered, why are they not collapsing under the weight of exposure? Then came the uncomfortable realization. The moment when someone revisits the past and notices details they once ignored. A word that did not fit. A reaction that was too calm. A kindness that contradicted the accusation. Regret does not arrive dramatically. It seeps in. It arrives as unease, as restlessness, as the faint but persistent suspicion that they may have been wrong about you all along, and once that suspicion takes root, it grows relentlessly. There is a particular kind of silence that follows this realization. It is not peaceful, it is heavy. It is the silence of people who cannot undo what they have already said, but can no longer say it again with the same confidence. They stop repeating the lie, not because they have suddenly become brave enough to confess the truth, but because the lie has lost its power. It no longer convinces even them. What is remarkable is that you did not need to orchestrate this reversal. You did not need to expose anyone, embarrass anyone, or demand recognition. Truth does not require theatrics. It requires patience. It requires integrity maintained under pressure. And in a world addicted to noise, quiet consistency becomes undeniable evidence. Now, without announcement or ceremony, the balance has shifted. People know. They may not say it out loud. Some will never say it at all. Pride will not allow it, but they know. And knowledge has a way of changing how people look at you, how they speak around you, how cautiously they tread where they once walked boldly. Innocence, once doubted, has revealed itself not through argument, but through endurance. And so you stand here, not vindicated by applause, but vindicated by reality itself. The truth did not rush to your defense. It waited until it could no longer be ignored. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful form of justice there is. Truth does not announce itself with noise, and that is the first thing most people misunderstand about how innocence is revealed. We are trained to expect justice to arrive dramatically with confessions, confrontations, and clear declarations of who was right and who was wrong. Yet truth has never depended on volume. It moves quietly, steadily, almost invisibly, and because of that it is often underestimated. When lies are spoken loudly, repeatedly, and with confidence, they create the illusion of dominance. But illusion cannot outlast reality. Truth does not compete with noise, it outlives it. In moments of accusation, falsehood feels powerful because it is immediate. It spreads quickly, feeds emotion, and satisfies the human hunger for certainty. Truth, on the other hand, requires patience. It asks people to observe rather than react, to reflect rather than repeat. That is why it appears slow. But slowness is not weakness, it is precision. Truth moves at the speed of understanding, not impulse, and understanding always takes time. When you are innocent, the temptation to explain everything is overwhelming. You want to correct every misunderstanding, answer every whisper, defend every detail. But truth does not need to be carried on your back like a burden. It carries itself. Each day you remain consistent, each moment you refuse to distort yourself in desperation, truth gathers quiet weight. People may not acknowledge it immediately, but they notice. They always do. Noise demands attention, truth earns recognition. Loud accusations burn brightly at first, but they burn fast. They exhaust themselves because they require constant energy to survive. Every lie needs reinforcement. Every false story needs repetition. Truth, however, does not need maintenance. It simply waits. And while it waits, it allows the lie to overextend itself, to contradict itself, to reveal its own fragility. There is something deeply unsettling about a truth that does not fight back. It forces observers to confront their assumptions. When someone expected to collapse under pressure remains steady, questions begin to form. Why is there no panic? Why is there no desperation? Why does the person accused continue living with quiet integrity? These questions are not asked out loud at first. They surface privately, internally, where defenses are weaker and honesty is harder to avoid. Time becomes truth's greatest ally. With each passing day, the emotional charge around the accusation fades. What once felt urgent becomes distant. When emotion cools, clarity begins to rise. People revisit events not with the heat of reaction, but with the calm of hindsight. And in that calm, inconsistencies become visible. The story no longer fits as neatly as it once did. Details feel forced. Motives seem exaggerated. The truth, which had been present all along, now stands unobstructed. Truth does not humiliate those who were wrong, it educates them. That is why it arrives quietly. It does not seek to shame, only to correct. People often realize the truth privately before they ever admit it publicly. Pride resists confession, but awareness cannot be undone. Once someone knows they misjudged you, they cannot unknow it. That realization changes how they speak, how they look at you, how they retell the story, if they tell it at all. What makes this process powerful is that it requires nothing from you except endurance. You are not responsible for convincing anyone. You are responsible only for remaining aligned with what is true. That alignment, maintained over time, becomes undeniable evidence. When truth finally surfaces, it does so without drama, without speeches, without declarations. It simply becomes obvious. And that is the paradox. The quiet arrival of truth is far more devastating to falsehood than any loud defense could ever be. Innocence is often misunderstood because people prefer stories that are simple, sharp, and emotionally satisfying. A complex truth demands patience, humility, and effort, qualities that are rarely convenient. When a situation is reduced to heroes and villains, the mind relaxes. It feels safe. It feels organized. But real human lives are not organized that way. They are layered, contradictory, unfinished. And because of that, innocence frequently suffers, not because it is weak, but because it is inconvenient. Most people do not judge with malice, they judge with haste. They hear fragments, observe isolated moments, and build entire conclusions on incomplete information. Complexity requires them to pause, to admit uncertainty, to hold multiple possibilities at once. That is uncomfortable. Simplicity, even when false, is easier to carry. It allows people to feel decisive rather than thoughtful, and so innocence, which often lives in the grey spaces between assumptions, is overlooked. There is also a quiet fear beneath this preference for simplicity. If the truth is complex, then judgment becomes risky. To admit complexity is to admit the possibility of being wrong. Many would rather cling to a flawed narrative than face the discomfort of revising their beliefs. Innocence threatens certainty, and certainty is addictive. It gives people a sense of control over a world that is otherwise unpredictable. When you are innocent, your reality does not fit neatly into the version others want to believe. Your motives are not as cleanly selfish or malicious as the story demands. Your actions may have been misunderstood, misinterpreted, or removed from their context. But context complicates outrage, and outrage is far more engaging than understanding, so the story is simplified and you are simplified with it. This simplification strips away your humanity. You become a symbol rather than a person, a role rather than a soul. And once that happens, innocence becomes invisible. People are no longer listening to you. They are listening to the version of you they have already decided upon. Everything you do is filtered through that assumption. Neutral actions appear suspicious. Silence looks like guilt. Calmness looks calculated. The truth does not change, but perception distorts it. Yet complexity has a quiet endurance that simplicity lacks. Simple stories collapse when exposed to time because time introduces nuance. People begin to notice contradictions between the narrative and reality. They observe your consistency where inconsistency was expected. They see restraint where reaction was predicted. Slowly, the simplified version of you begins to feel inaccurate, even dishonest. This is where discomfort returns. The mind resists it at first. It tries to adjust the story without abandoning it. But reality does not cooperate with false edits. Over time, the weight of lived evidence becomes too heavy to ignore. Innocence, once dismissed as unlikely, begins to feel plausible. And once it feels plausible, it becomes unavoidable. What makes this process painful is that innocence must endure misunderstanding without becoming bitter. It must survive being misread without surrendering its integrity. This endurance is not passive weakness, it is quiet strength. It refuses to distort itself to fit someone else's narrative. It remains whole even when misunderstood. Eventually, people realize that the truth they avoided was not complicated because it was deceptive, but because it was human. And humanity is never simple. When that realization settles in, innocence no longer needs to explain itself. It becomes evident in hindsight, undeniable in memory, and unmistakable in contrast to the false certainty that once replaced it. Innocence is not rejected because it is fragile. It is rejected because it asks more of people than they are ready to give. Being falsely judged is one of the most painful forms of suffering because it does not merely criticize what you did, it questions who you are. Actions can be explained, mistakes can be corrected, but when your character is put on trial, the wound goes much deeper. It reaches into the core of your identity, into the place where you understand yourself, and suddenly that place feels invaded. You are not defending a moment anymore, you are defending your very existence. When someone accuses your character, they are not saying you were wrong once, they are saying you are wrong as a person, and that kind of judgment lingers. It follows you into quiet moments, into sleepless nights, into conversations where you feel the weight of being misunderstood, even when no one says a word. The pain is not always loud. Often it is silent, internal, and exhausting. You replay moments in your mind, not because you doubt your innocence, but because you are trying to understand how truth became so distorted. False judgment isolates you. People pull away, not necessarily because they believe the worst, but because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. Distance feels safer than discernment. You may find yourself standing alone, watching relationships change, watching trust dissolve, watching familiar faces grow cautious. And the cruelest part is that you did nothing to deserve this shift. The suffering comes not from guilt, but from being seen as guilty when you are not. There is also a peculiar helplessness that accompanies false judgment. When you know the truth, yet cannot make others see it, words begin to feel inadequate. Every explanation sounds like an excuse. Every defense sounds like desperation. You realize that speaking more does not bring clarity. It sometimes deepens suspicion. And so you are forced into a silence you did not choose, carrying a truth that has no immediate audience. This is where the pain sharpens. You are aware that time will eventually reveal what words cannot, but waiting hurts. Waiting while your name is questioned hurts. Waiting while others build opinions without you hurts. The injustice is not only in being misjudged, but in being unable to correct it on your own terms. You are dependent on reality itself to intervene, and reality does not rush. False judgment also distorts how you see yourself if you are not careful. Even the strongest mind can begin to feel the pressure of repetition. When a lie is echoed often enough, it knocks on the door of self-doubt. You may catch yourself wondering how others could believe it so easily, or whether there was something you missed, something you should have done differently. This is the quiet danger of unjust judgment, not that it convinces you that you are guilty, but that it tempts you to shrink, to dim, to become cautious with your authenticity. Yet there is something quietly transformative hidden inside this suffering. When your identity is attacked unfairly, you are forced to anchor yourself deeper than public opinion. You learn to distinguish between who you are and how you are perceived. You begin to understand that reputation is fragile, but character is not. This realization does not remove the pain, but it gives it meaning. You stop needing applause to confirm your integrity. The suffering of false judgment also reveals something about the world. It teaches you how quickly people confuse confidence with truth and silence with guilt. It exposes how easily narratives are accepted when they satisfy emotion rather than accuracy. This knowledge is heavy, but it is also clarifying. It strips away illusions about fairness and replaces them with wisdom. In time, when innocence becomes visible again, the relief is real, but the scars remain. Not because the truth did not prevail, but because you remember what it cost to wait for it. You remember how it felt to be doubted without evidence, to be questioned without cause, to be misunderstood without recourse. And that memory changes you. It deepens your empathy, sharpens your discernment, and strengthens your inner foundation. False judgment hurts because it attacks identity, but surviving it reshapes identity into something unshakable. Innocence does not need to shout or defend itself endlessly, and this truth feels almost offensive in a world that rewards the loudest voice. When you are wrongly accused, everything in you wants to explain, to clarify, to prove, to correct every false detail before it hardens into belief. Silence feels dangerous, restraint feels like surrender, and yet innocence survives not by constant defense, but by quiet consistency. It stands firm without performance, trusting that truth does not require agitation to remain true. Endless defense is often mistaken for strength, but it is usually born from fear, the fear of being misunderstood, forgotten, or permanently misjudged. Innocence, however, is not afraid of time. It knows that explanations offered in panic lose their credibility. Words spoken under pressure sound rehearsed, even when they are sincere. The more you argue, the more you appear invested in winning rather than being truthful. And truth, paradoxically, loses power when it is forced. There is a dignity in restraint that accusation cannot imitate. When someone is guilty, they must manage impressions. They must control narratives, anticipate questions, adjust stories. Innocence carries no such burden. It does not need to remember what it said yesterday. It does not need to anticipate traps. Its simplicity is not naivete. It is alignment, and alignment produces calm. That calm unsettles those who expect anxiety, desperation, or defensiveness. Silence, in this context, is not weakness. It is discernment. Innocence chooses carefully when to speak and when to wait. It understands that not every audience deserves an explanation, and not every question is asked in good faith. Some people do not seek clarity. They seek confirmation of what they already believe. Defending yourself to them only feeds the fire. Innocence refuses to perform for an unwilling mind. There is also a deeper truth at work. Real innocence trusts reality more than rhetoric. It understands that behavior repeated over time is more convincing than arguments repeated in a moment. While words can be twisted, actions accumulate. Day after day of steady character builds a quiet record that no accusation can erase. Innocence lets that record speak, even when it is uncomfortable to wait. This refusal to defend endlessly creates a strange reversal. Accusers expect engagement. They expect rebuttals, explanations, emotional reactions. When those do not arrive, they are left alone with their claims. Without opposition, their words echo uncomfortably. People begin to listen more closely, not to the noise, but to the absence of it. They start watching instead of reacting, and watching reveals things arguments never could. Innocence also understands that over-defending can dilute truth. When you answer every charge, you elevate every accusation to the same level of importance. You give weight to claims that do not deserve it. Innocence is selective. It does not dignify falsehood with endless response. It waits for what is solid to surface, knowing that truth has a gravity that pulls attention back to itself. There is pain in this restraint. It requires swallowing words that feel justified. It requires enduring moments where silence is misinterpreted as guilt. Innocence pays this price not because it enjoys suffering, but because it understands the long game. It knows that defending your character too aggressively can actually weaken it in the eyes of those who are watching quietly, undecided. Over time, something shifts. People notice that you are not campaigning for approval. They notice that your life continues without distortion. They notice that your reactions are measured, not manipulative. And slowly, almost without announcement, credibility returns. Not because you demanded it, but because you never abandoned yourself to chase it. Innocence does not need to shout because it is not trying to overpower falsehood. It is letting falsehood collapse under its own weight. And when that collapse happens, it is unmistakable. Silence, once misunderstood, becomes the loudest proof of all. Silence, when rooted in truth, becomes stronger than any argument, and this is one of the hardest lessons for a wounded soul to accept. Everything in us is trained to believe that words are power, that the right explanation, the perfect sentence, or the strongest defense can reverse misunderstanding. We grow up believing that if we speak clearly enough, people will see clearly. But truth teaches a more unsettling reality. There are moments when words weaken truth instead of strengthening it, and silence carries a weight no argument can match. Arguments rely on opposition. They need resistance to justify their existence. The moment you argue, you step into a shared arena with the lie, granting it legitimacy. You place truth and falsehood on the same stage, as if they are equals competing for approval. Silence refuses this false equality. Silence says, without saying, I do not need to wrestle with what is not real. That refusal unsettles people more than the most eloquent defense ever could. When silence comes from guilt, it feels hollow, it feels tense, evasive, brittle. But silence rooted in truth feels different. It is calm, grounded, unhurried. It does not scan the room for approval or brace itself for attack. It simply exists. And human intuition is far sharper than people admit. Others may not immediately articulate what they sense, but they feel the difference. Truthful silence has a gravity that pulls attention inward. It makes people think. Arguments make noise. Silence creates reflection. Words, especially under accusation, are easily distorted. Tone is questioned. Motives are doubted. Every sentence becomes evidence to be twisted. Silence removes this weapon entirely. It gives nothing to manipulate. It offers no fragments to reframe. In that emptiness, observers are forced to look elsewhere, not at what you say, but at who you are. They begin watching patterns instead of listening to claims, and patterns tell the truth more reliably than speeches ever could. There is also a moral strength in silence that arguments lack. Arguing often aims to win. Silence aims to remain true. One seeks victory, the other seeks integrity. When you argue, even honestly, you can appear invested in being right. When you remain silent, you appear invested in being real. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Those who are watching carefully are not asking who speaks best. They are asking who remains consistent. Silence also exposes the emotional imbalance of falsehood. Lies require reaction. They feed on engagement, outrage, defense, and rebuttal. When silence meets accusation, the lie starves. It begins to sound excessive, desperate, overworked. Without pushback, exaggeration becomes obvious. Emotion feels disproportionate. The accuser starts to reveal themselves, not through what you say, but through what they continue to say when no one is fighting them. This does not mean silence is easy. It is often agonizing. It feels like surrendering control. It means trusting that reality will speak on your behalf, even when it feels slow and unfair. Silence asks you to tolerate being misunderstood longer than feels reasonable. It asks you to endure moments where your name is questioned and your intentions are doubted, without rushing to repair your image. That endurance is not passivity, it is discipline. Silence rooted in truth is an act of faith. Faith in time, in consistency, in the natural exposure of what is false. It assumes that people are capable of noticing patterns, even if they are slow to admit them. It assumes that truth does not expire just because it is quiet. And most importantly, it assumes that your identity does not depend on public approval to remain intact. Over time, silence begins to speak for you. People notice that you are not defensive. They notice that you are not performing innocence. You are living it. They notice that your life continues without distortion, without frantic corrections, without bitterness, and slowly, quietly, the narrative shifts. Not because you argued better, but because you did not argue at all. In the end, arguments convince minds for a moment. Silence rooted in truth convinces consciences for a lifetime. False certainty is fragile, even when it wears the mask of confidence, and eventually it collapses under the quiet pressure of reality. At first it looks unshakable. It speaks loudly, repeats itself often, and gathers agreement through volume rather than depth. People mistake this confidence for truth because it feels decisive. It feels settled. It offers a clear position in a confusing world. But certainty that is not anchored in truth is always performing, and performance cannot be sustained forever. False certainty survives on speed. It forms conclusions quickly and discourages reflection. The faster a judgment is made, the less room there is for doubt. That is why accusations often sound so sure of themselves in the beginning. They do not pause to verify, they rush to define. This rush creates momentum, and momentum can look like strength. But speed bypasses accuracy, and what is built without accuracy cannot endure. Reality is patient. It does not argue back. It does not rush to correct misunderstanding. It simply continues to exist. And as time passes, reality introduces details that false certainty cannot absorb. New moments arrive, new interactions occur, patterns repeat. The confident story must constantly adjust itself to fit these developments, and each adjustment weakens it. What began as certainty slowly becomes effort. The problem with false certainty is that it demands consistency from a world that refuses to be scripted. Human behavior, especially innocent behavior, does not conform neatly to accusations. When someone continues to act with steadiness, kindness, restraint, or integrity, the accusation begins to feel exaggerated. The certainty that once felt clean now feels strained. People may not voice it, but internally they begin to sense that something does not add up. False certainty also depends on emotional reinforcement. It feeds on outrage, agreement, and repetition. But emotions fade. What once felt urgent loses intensity. When the emotional charge drains away, what remains is the structure of the claim itself. And without emotion holding it together, the structure often collapses. It cannot stand on facts alone because facts were never its foundation. Reality does not expose false certainty all at once. It does so gradually, almost mercifully. A single contradiction here, an unexpected reaction there, a moment where the accused behaves in a way that does not align with guilt. These moments accumulate quietly. No single one destroys the narrative, but together they erode it. Certainty begins to wobble not because it was attacked, but because it could no longer explain what people were seeing. There is also a psychological shift that occurs. At first, people defend their certainty fiercely because admitting doubt feels like admitting failure. But as inconsistencies pile up, defending the certainty becomes exhausting. It requires effort to ignore what is obvious. It requires mental gymnastics to preserve a belief that no longer fits. Slowly, people stop defending it as passionately. Their tone changes, their language softens. Absolute statements turn into vague ones. Certainty retreats. What ultimately breaks false certainty is not confrontation, but observation. When people watch long enough, they begin to trust what they see over what they were told. Lived reality becomes more persuasive than inherited opinion. The story loses its grip because it no longer explains the present, and any belief that cannot explain reality is destined to fail. False certainty collapses because it is rigid. It cannot adapt without revealing itself. Truth, on the other hand, is flexible because it is real. It can withstand scrutiny, time, and contradiction because it does not depend on control. When reality continues to confirm innocence, false certainty has only two options: evolve into humility or dissolve into silence. Most choose silence. The collapse is rarely dramatic. There is no announcement, no public reversal. It happens internally, privately, often without acknowledgement. People simply stop insisting. They stop repeating the accusation. They stop speaking with authority. And in that quiet withdrawal, the truth stands exposed, not because it fought harder, but because it remained when false certainty could not. Reality always wins, not through force, but through presence. Time exposes inconsistencies that accusations cannot hide forever, and this is where false narratives begin to unravel in ways no confrontation ever could. Accusations thrive in the moment. They rely on shock, urgency, and emotional momentum. In the beginning, everything feels convincing because no one has paused long enough to test the story against reality. But time does not rush, and that is precisely why it is so dangerous to lies. It gives space for patterns to emerge, and patterns are merciless to anything untrue. At first, accusations feel complete. They sound polished, confident, and final. People assume that if something is stated with such certainty, it must be grounded in fact. But time introduces repetition, and repetition is the enemy of fabrication. A lie must remember itself. It must remain consistent across situations, moods, and moments. That is far harder than it appears. Small details begin to shift. Emphases change. What was once claimed with conviction is later softened, reframed, or quietly abandoned. These shifts may seem insignificant, but they accumulate. Time also allows observers to move from reaction to observation. In the heat of accusation, people react emotionally. They choose sides quickly, often without reflection. But as days pass, emotions cool. Curiosity replaces outrage. People begin watching instead of listening. They notice behavior rather than words. And behavior, repeated over time, tells a story far more reliable than any accusation ever could. Innocence has a unique advantage here. It does not need to maintain a performance. It does not need to remember which version of itself it presented last week. It simply continues being what it is. This consistency becomes visible over time. When someone accused of wrongdoing continues to act with restraint, integrity, and steadiness, the accusation begins to feel out of place. Guilt is usually erratic. Innocence is remarkably stable. Time also introduces new contexts, new situations where the original accusation should logically resurface if it were true. But when it doesn't, people notice. They see you respond to pressure without manipulation. They see you handle authority without defensiveness. They see you maintain character when no one is watching. These moments quietly contradict the accusation, and contradictions, even subtle ones, weaken belief. What makes time so effective is that it does not argue. It does not try to persuade anyone. It simply places evidence in front of people again and again until denial becomes harder than acceptance. Accusations, by contrast, must keep talking. They must keep reminding people what to think. They must stay loud to remain alive. Over time, this contrast becomes obvious. One side is still insisting, the other is simply existing. There is also a psychological fatigue that sets in. Defending a false narrative requires energy. It requires attention. It requires emotional investment. Over time, people grow tired of maintaining certainty that no longer feels natural. They begin to disengage. They stop repeating the story with the same intensity. Their language becomes cautious. Absolutes turn into maybes. Confidence turns into silence. Time does not force this change. It allows it. Time also gives people the chance to revisit their own judgment privately. Away from public pressure, away from group opinion, they reconsider. They replay events with new information. They notice what they missed. This quiet reconsideration is where truth often wins, not in public debates, but in private reflection. Once someone sees an inconsistency clearly, they cannot unsee it. Accusations often rely on a frozen image of a person, captured at a single moment and defined forever by it. Time disrupts this freeze. It shows growth, consistency, and continuity. It reveals that the person accused is not behaving like the accusation predicts. And when predictions fail repeatedly, belief erodes. Eventually, time does what no defense could do. It makes the accusation feel outdated. It belongs to the past, while reality belongs to the present. People stop referencing it, not because it was disproven in court, but because it no longer explains what they see. And anything that cannot explain reality loses relevance. Time does not rush to clear innocence. It waits until innocence is undeniable, and by the time it speaks, it does not need words at all. Calm behavior unsettles lies more than emotional reactions ever could, because lies expect chaos, not composure. False narratives are built with an assumption at their core, that pressure will provoke panic, that accusation will trigger defense, that suspicion will force a reaction intense enough to confirm guilt. When that reaction never comes, the lie loses its script. Calmness becomes disruptive. It does not cooperate with expectation, and that refusal creates discomfort in everyone who believed the story would unfold a certain way. Emotional reactions are easy to misinterpret. Anger can be labeled aggression. Tears can be called manipulation. Passion can be framed as instability. When you react emotionally under accusation, even honestly, your reaction becomes raw material for distortion. Calmness denies that opportunity. It offers nothing dramatic to twist, nothing explosive to exaggerate. It strips the lie of momentum by refusing to feed it. Calm does not mean indifference. It does not mean you feel nothing. Often it means you feel everything and still choose restraint. This is what makes it so unsettling. People expect innocence to be frantic, desperate to be believed. When innocence remains composed, it challenges the assumption that panic equals sincerity. Observers begin to question their own expectations. They wonder why someone under pressure is not unraveling. That question quietly weakens the accusation. Lies thrive on emotional imbalance. They need contrast, your agitation against their certainty, your defense against their confidence. Calmness flattens that contrast. It creates an emotional neutrality that forces people to look beyond reactions and examine substance. When there is no visible turmoil to analyze, attention shifts to behavior, consistency, and long-term patterns. This shift is dangerous for falsehood, because patterns reveal what emotions can hide. Calm behavior also communicates something powerful without words: inner alignment. People instinctively sense when someone is anchored. They may not articulate it, but they feel it. Calmness suggests that a person is not internally fractured by guilt. Guilt creates tension. It leaks through posture, tone, urgency, and over-explanation. Calmness, sustained over time, suggests coherence, and coherence does not align with deception. This composure frustrates those who rely on provoking reactions to maintain control of the narrative. When accusations fail to provoke outrage or breakdown, they must escalate to stay relevant, and escalation exposes excess. What once sounded reasonable begins to feel exaggerated. What once felt urgent begins to feel obsessive. Calmness does not attack the lie. It invites the lie to overextend itself. There is also a moral clarity in calmness that arguments lack. Calmness signals that you are not trying to overpower anyone emotionally. You are not trying to dominate the conversation. You are not trying to win. You are simply remaining present. This absence of agenda is unsettling in a world where most speech is strategic. People begin to trust what feels unforced. Calm behavior also creates space for observers to think independently. Emotional chaos pressures people into quick judgments. Calmness removes that pressure. It slows the room down. It gives others permission to pause, to reconsider, to notice details they overlooked. In that pause, assumptions weaken. Certainty softens. The story becomes less rigid. Maintaining calm under false accusation is not easy. It requires self-mastery. It means resisting the urge to correct every misunderstanding, to respond to every provocation, to prove yourself in every moment. This restraint is often misunderstood at first. Some may read calmness as arrogance or detachment, but over time, interpretation changes. What looked like indifference begins to look like strength. Calmness endures longer than emotion. Emotional reactions flare and fade. Calmness remains, and because it remains, it becomes a reference point. People remember how you carried yourself. They remember your tone. They remember your steadiness. When doubt eventually enters their minds, calmness becomes evidence. They replay it. They compare it to the behavior they would expect from someone guilty. The comparison does not favor the lie. In the end, calm behavior does not prove innocence instantly. It does something slower and more effective. It makes guilt look improbable. And once guilt looks improbable, belief in the accusation begins to collapse on its own. Calmness does not shout truth. It lets truth be noticed. Observation eventually replaces gossip when facts stop aligning with the story, and this is the moment when false narratives begin to lose their grip. Gossip thrives in distance. It survives when people are not close enough to reality to test what they are hearing. It feeds on repetition rather than evidence, on emotion rather than experience. As long as people rely on second-hand information, gossip feels convincing. But the moment observation enters, gossip becomes fragile. At first, gossip feels easier than observation. It requires no effort, no patience, no responsibility. Someone tells a story, and others pass it along, each time adding confidence even as accuracy fades. Gossip creates a sense of belonging, shared outrage, shared judgment, shared certainty. Observation, by contrast, demands independence. It asks people to pause, to watch, to think for themselves. That shift does not happen immediately, but when it does, everything changes. Observation begins quietly. Someone notices that your behavior does not match the version of you they were told to believe. It might be a small thing, how you handle pressure, how you speak when you could retaliate, how you treat people who cannot offer you anything in return. These details seem insignificant in isolation, but they linger. They create friction between rumor and reality. Gossip depends on smooth acceptance. Observation introduces resistance. As people spend more time around you, the story becomes harder to maintain. Gossip paints you as a fixed character, static, predictable, permanently flawed. Observation reveals movement. It shows nuance, restraint, depth. It reveals moments that gossip cannot explain. And when a story cannot explain what someone is seeing with their own eyes, trust in that story begins to erode. There is also a psychological shift that happens when observation replaces gossip. Gossip allows people to feel informed without being accountable. Observation removes that comfort. When someone observes directly, they become responsible for their judgment. They can no longer hide behind, "That's what I heard." They must confront the possibility that they participated in something unfair. That realization is uncomfortable, so it arrives slowly, cautiously, often without announcement. Observation also exposes exaggeration. Gossip grows with each retelling. It sharpens edges, simplifies motives, dramatizes events. But reality is rarely that dramatic. When people observe calmly over time, they notice how extreme the gossip sounds compared to lived experience. The contrast becomes embarrassing. What once felt justified now feels excessive, and excess is one of the first signs that belief is weakening. Another reason observation overtakes gossip is fatigue. Gossip requires constant reinforcement. It needs people to keep talking, reacting, and agreeing. Over time, that energy fades. People grow tired of repeating the same story, especially when nothing new supports it. Observation, on the other hand, renews itself. Each interaction provides fresh information, and fresh information slowly outweighs stale rumor. Observation also reveals something gossip cannot hide: consistency. Innocence expresses itself through repetition, the same calm tone, the same measured responses, the same lack of contradiction. Gossip expects deviation. It predicts eventual exposure, emotional collapse, or revealing behavior. When none of that happens, when consistency continues uninterrupted, people begin to doubt the narrative that promised otherwise. What makes observation so powerful is that it does not need persuasion. People trust what they see more than what they are told, even if they do not admit it immediately. Observation bypasses pride. Someone may publicly maintain the old story while privately revising their belief, but belief, once revised, cannot be forced back into its old shape. The gossip loses influence quietly. Over time, conversations change. People stop bringing up the accusation as often. When it does come up, the tone is different, less certain, more cautious. Someone says, "I'm not sure anymore," or "that doesn't really match what I've seen." These small hesitations signal a major shift. Gossip has lost its authority. Observation has taken its place. This transition rarely ends with public apologies or dramatic reversals. More often, it ends with silence. The story simply fades. It no longer excites, convinces, or explains. And in that fading, innocence gains space, not through argument, not through defense, but through the quiet power of being seen rather than spoken about. When observation replaces gossip, truth no longer needs protection. It becomes visible on its own. Regret enters quietly, often as discomfort rather than confession, and this is why it is so difficult to recognize at first. People imagine regret as dramatic, a tearful apology, a sudden admission, a clear acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But real regret is rarely that honest. It does not rush forward to announce itself. It slips in slowly, disguised as unease, restlessness, and subtle shifts in behavior. It lives in the space between what someone believed and what they are now forced to see. When people realize they were wrong about you, their first reaction is not remorse, it is resistance. Admitting regret would require them to confront their own judgment, their own participation, their own certainty. That is uncomfortable. Pride instinctively shields the ego from such exposure. So instead of confession, regret chooses a quieter form. It shows up as hesitation, as avoidance, as a sudden lack of enthusiasm when your name is mentioned. This quiet regret often begins with a thought no one hears. Something doesn't feel right anymore. The story they once repeated with confidence now creates internal tension. It no longer sits comfortably in the mind. When they think about you, there is a faint sense of dissonance, a mismatch between what they believed and what they have observed. This discomfort is regret's first language. People rarely confess regret because confession demands vulnerability. It requires humility, and humility threatens the image people have of themselves as fair, perceptive, or morally sound. Instead, regret hides behind silence. They stop speaking as freely as before. They stop making strong claims. Their certainty dissolves into vague statements. What once sounded sharp now sounds cautious. Regret also alters behavior before it alters words. Someone who once dismissed you may suddenly become polite. Someone who ignored you may begin acknowledging you. Someone who spoke against you may grow strangely quiet in your presence. These changes are not accidental. They are the body responding to a conscience that has been disturbed. Regret does not correct itself publicly. It adjusts privately. There is often guilt mixed into this regret, but it is not the kind that seeks forgiveness. It is the kind that seeks relief. People want the discomfort to go away without having to face its cause, so they distance themselves from the situation rather than resolve it. They avoid conversations that might force reflection. They change topics. They redirect attention. Silence becomes a refuge from accountability. What makes this quiet regret powerful is that it cannot be undone. Once someone realizes they misjudged you, even if they never say it out loud, that knowledge becomes permanent. They may suppress it, rationalize it, or minimize it, but it remains. It influences how they remember the past and how they approach you in the future. The certainty they once had is gone forever. Regret also reshapes memory. People begin replaying moments they once ignored. They remember your restraint, your calm, your consistency, and these memories now carry a different meaning. What was once interpreted as suspicious now appears dignified. What was once dismissed as weakness now looks like strength. Regret quietly rewrites the narrative, not in public statements, but in private understanding. This kind of regret is heavy because it offers no release. Confession could bring relief, but pride blocks the path. Apology could restore balance, but ego refuses the cost. So regret settles into the background of the mind, manifesting as discomfort whenever the past is revisited. It is a silent companion, reminding them that they were wrong without ever allowing them to make it right. From the outside, you may never witness this regret directly. You may never receive an apology. You may never hear an admission. But you will sense the shift. The tone has changed. The posture is different. The confidence is gone. And that absence speaks louder than any words ever could. This is the quiet justice of truth. It does not force people to confess. It allows them to know, and knowing is often punishment enough. Regret that cannot be confessed becomes a lifelong discomfort, a reminder that innocence was misunderstood and truth was delayed but never denied. Regret does not need a voice to exist. It only needs awareness, and awareness, once awakened, never sleeps again. People stop repeating lies when they no longer believe them themselves, and this is one of the clearest signs that truth has begun its quiet work. Lies are sustained not merely by speech, but by conviction. As long as someone believes a false story, repeating it feels natural, even righteous. It carries energy, it carries purpose. But the moment belief erodes, repetition becomes uncomfortable. Words that once flowed easily begin to feel heavy in the mouth. At first, the change is subtle. The lie is still told, but with less enthusiasm. The tone shifts, the certainty softens. What was once stated boldly is now phrased cautiously. "I heard that" replaces "I know that." These small linguistic changes reveal a larger internal shift. The speaker is no longer fully aligned with the story, and misalignment makes repetition exhausting. Lies demand internal agreement to survive. When doubt enters, the mind resists the effort required to keep pretending. Each repetition forces a person to confront the growing gap between what they say and what they now sense might be untrue. That gap creates discomfort. Over time, discomfort discourages speech. Silence becomes easier than contradiction, especially contradiction with one's own conscience. There is also a social cost that emerges when belief fades. Repeating a lie no longer feels safe. The speaker begins to worry about being questioned, challenged, or exposed. They are no longer defending a truth, they are maintaining an image. That maintenance requires vigilance, and vigilance is tiring. It is far easier to stop speaking than to keep justifying something that no longer feels solid. This is why lies often disappear rather than collapse. People imagine false narratives being defeated by evidence or public confrontation, but more often they simply fade from conversation. Someone stops bringing it up. Another changes the subject. A third avoids the topic altogether. The lie is not corrected aloud, it is quietly abandoned. Its disappearance is not dramatic, but it is decisive. What makes this moment powerful is that silence replaces repetition without instruction. No one announces, "We were wrong." No one gathers to revise the story. People simply sense that continuing no longer feels right. The lie has lost its internal support, and without belief, speech becomes hollow. This shift often confuses those who were wronged. You may expect an apology, an explanation, a correction. Instead, you receive quiet distance. Conversations that once felt charged now feel neutral. The subject never comes up. It can feel incomplete, even unfair. But what has happened is more significant than an apology. The lie has lost its life source. People stop repeating lies when they realize those lies no longer explain reality. Observation, time, and consistency have done their work. The story no longer fits what they see. Continuing to repeat it would require willful blindness. And most people, when faced with sustained evidence, choose comfort over conflict. Silence becomes their compromise. There is also an unspoken shame involved. Repeating a lie after doubt has entered feels like self-betrayal. Even those who never valued truth highly tend to value their own coherence. Saying something you no longer believe fractures that coherence. So the mouth closes, not out of virtue, but out of self-preservation. This silence is not neutral, it is a verdict. It signals that the narrative has failed, that it can no longer command confidence, that it cannot survive scrutiny. And while it may not restore what was lost, it prevents further damage. The harm stops spreading. The infection no longer travels. Over time, the absence of repetition rewrites memory. New listeners never hear the lie. Old listeners forget its details. Without reinforcement, falsehood decays. It becomes vague, distant, irrelevant. What once defined you in the minds of others slowly loses shape, then meaning. And in that erosion, space is created for truth to exist again. Truth does not always replace lies with loud declarations. Often it replaces them with silence. And silence in this case is not avoidance, it is surrender. The lie has nothing more to say because no one believes it enough to keep speaking. When people stop repeating lies, they are not defending truth yet, but they are no longer resisting it. And that is the turning point. Pride prevents apologies, but awareness still brings internal accountability, and this is one of the most uncomfortable positions a human being can occupy. An apology would offer release. It would close the loop, restore balance, and allow the conscience to rest. But pride resists that relief because it demands the protection of self-image. To apologize is to admit fallibility, to acknowledge that one's judgment failed, that one's certainty harmed someone undeserving. For many, preserving the illusion of being right feels safer than being honest. Yet awareness does not ask permission to arrive. Once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. Even when pride locks the mouth, awareness speaks inwardly. It begins to rearrange thoughts, reactions, and memories. A person may never say, "I was wrong about you," but their inner world knows it. And knowing creates a quiet form of accountability that cannot be escaped by silence. This internal accountability often shows itself in subtle ways. People hesitate where they once spoke freely. They grow careful where they once were bold. The ease they once felt in judging you is gone. Pride may still prevent them from apologizing, but it cannot restore their former certainty. That certainty died the moment awareness entered. What remains is restraint, a sign not of innocence, but of recognition. Pride works by maintaining appearances. It focuses on how things look rather than how they are. Apologizing would fracture the image a person holds of themselves as perceptive, fair, or justified. So instead of admitting fault, they adjust behavior. They become quieter, more cautious, less involved. This adjustment is not kindness, it is containment. They are managing the discomfort of knowing without confessing. Awareness also reshapes memory in ways pride cannot control. Moments that were once used to justify judgment are replayed with new understanding. Words are remembered differently. Silences take on new meaning. What was once dismissed becomes significant. This revision happens privately, often against the will of the person experiencing it. Pride may block apology, but it cannot stop reinterpretation. Internal accountability is heavier than public accountability because it offers no release. Public accountability allows correction, forgiveness, and closure. Internal accountability offers only awareness. It sits quietly in the mind, surfacing at unexpected times, when your name is mentioned, when a similar situation arises, when they witness someone else being judged unfairly. Each time, it reminds them of the truth they chose not to speak. There is also a subtle fear that accompanies this awareness. Apologizing would require reopening the past, risking rejection, or facing consequences. Pride often disguises this fear as strength. It's better to move on, they tell themselves. But moving on without reconciliation does not erase accountability. It relocates it. The responsibility moves inward, where it cannot be challenged or resolved. This is why you may notice people behaving differently around you without ever addressing what happened. They are navigating the tension between pride and awareness. They cannot deny what they now know, but they cannot bring themselves to admit it. So they exist in a narrow middle ground, polite, distant, careful. This behavior is not indifference, it is self-protection. Internal accountability also changes how people judge others in the future. Once someone realizes they were wrong about you, they become less confident in their judgments elsewhere. Pride may prevent them from acknowledging this lesson out loud, but it still shapes their thinking. They pause more, they hesitate before assuming. They remember the cost of being wrong, even if they never named it. From the outside, this may feel unsatisfying. You may wish for acknowledgement, for apology, for justice spoken aloud. But something real has happened nonetheless. Awareness has taken root. And awareness carries consequences. Even when pride resists confession, it alters behavior, weakens arrogance, and limits future harm. In many ways, internal accountability is a quieter form of justice. It does not restore what was lost, but it prevents repetition. It ensures that the person who misjudged you can never return to the comfort of ignorance. They must live with the knowledge of what they failed to see, and that knowledge follows them. Pride may win the argument of silence, but awareness wins the war of conscience. And conscience, once awakened, never truly goes quiet again. Consistency in character becomes evidence when words lose credibility, and this is where innocence gains its strongest footing. Words are powerful, but they are also fragile. They can be twisted, misquoted, exaggerated, or stripped of their original intent. In moments of accusation, words often become weapons rather than tools for understanding. Every sentence is inspected, every phrase dissected, every explanation reframed to fit an existing narrative. Eventually, language itself becomes unreliable. And when that happens, something far more persuasive steps forward: repeated behavior. Character reveals itself not in isolated moments, but in patterns. Anyone can perform goodness once. Anyone can sound sincere for a short time. But character is what remains when no one is applauding, when no one is watching closely, when there is nothing to gain. Consistency exposes what is real because it cannot be faked indefinitely. A lie can survive a conversation. It cannot survive a lifestyle. When words lose credibility, people stop listening for explanations and start watching for alignment. They observe how you respond to pressure, how you treat those who cannot benefit you, how you behave when provoked, ignored, or misunderstood. These moments accumulate quietly. No single action proves innocence, but together they form a body of evidence that speaks without asking permission. This is deeply frustrating for false narratives. Lies depend on moments, selected fragments frozen in time and stripped of context. Consistent character disrupts this tactic by refusing to remain frozen. Day after day, your behavior continues to contradict the accusation. You do not become harsher when bitterness would be expected. You do not become manipulative when desperation would be understandable. You do not become defensive when blame would justify it. Instead, you remain recognizable to yourself. That recognition is powerful. Consistency also removes the need for performance. When you are anchored in character, you are not adjusting yourself to convince anyone. You are not calculating how you appear. You are not managing impressions. You simply live, and that lack of strategy becomes noticeable. People sense when someone is acting versus when someone is being. Acting requires energy, being does not. Over time, that difference becomes obvious. There is something disarming about a person who does not change according to the audience. Consistency makes it difficult to maintain suspicion. If you are hiding something, people expect cracks, emotional leaks, contradictions, overreactions, defensiveness. When those cracks never appear, belief in the accusation weakens. It does not collapse all at once, but it loosens. Doubt creeps in quietly. Consistency also creates a timeline, and timelines are dangerous for falsehood. Lies prefer urgency. They thrive on immediacy. They do not want time to pass because time invites comparison. But when months pass and your character remains stable, the accusation begins to feel outdated. It belongs to a version of reality that no longer exists. People may not admit this out loud, but they feel it. The story no longer explains the present. Another quiet power of consistency is that it shifts authority. Words grant authority to the speaker. Character grants authority to reality. When your behavior speaks for you, you are no longer dependent on who controls the conversation. Truth moves from debate to demonstration, and demonstration is far harder to dismiss. Consistency also protects you internally. While words are vulnerable to misinterpretation, character remains intact. Even when others misunderstand you, you know who you are because you see it lived out daily. This internal stability matters. It keeps you from becoming reactive, from reshaping yourself to appease doubt, from abandoning integrity to accelerate validation. You remain whole while waiting. Over time, people begin referencing your character instead of the accusation, even if they do not say it directly. They say things like, "That doesn't really sound like you," or "I've never seen you act that way." These statements mark a shift. The narrative has lost its grip because lived evidence has replaced hearsay. You are no longer an idea, you are an experience. What makes this form of evidence so powerful is that it cannot be argued against easily. Someone can debate words. They cannot debate months or years of observed behavior without sounding unreasonable. Consistency does not humiliate the lie, it renders it unnecessary. People stop defending the accusation because defending it requires ignoring what they have seen repeatedly. In the end, character does not rush to clear your name. It does something more enduring. It establishes who you are beyond dispute. And once that foundation is laid, words, whether false or true, lose their power to redefine you. When credibility fails, character remains. And when character remains consistent, innocence no longer needs to be declared. It becomes obvious. Vindication does not require revenge, exposure, or public correction, and this truth often feels counterintuitive to a wounded heart. When you have been wronged, misunderstood, or falsely judged, the instinct to clear your name publicly is strong. You imagine that justice must be loud to be real, that wrong must be confronted dramatically, that truth must be displayed for all to see. Yet real vindication rarely follows that script. It arrives without spectacle, without confrontation, and without the satisfaction of watching someone else fall. Revenge promises relief, but it delivers captivity. It ties your peace to someone else's downfall. The moment you pursue revenge, your life becomes a reaction rather than a direction. You are no longer moving forward, you are circling the wound. Vindication that depends on revenge keeps the past alive, giving power to the very injustice you wish to escape. True vindication frees you from needing the offender at all. Exposure feels tempting because it offers validation. You want the world to see what you saw, to feel what you felt, to recognize what was hidden. But exposure often shifts focus away from truth and towards spectacle. It invites debate, sides, and endless reinterpretation. Instead of clarity, it can create noise. Instead of healing, it can reopen wounds. Vindication does not require everyone to know what happened. It requires reality to be restored. Public correction also seems necessary at first. You want names cleared, records fixed, narratives rewritten. Yet public correction depends on public memory, and public memory is unreliable. People forget, distort, and move on. If your peace depends on public acknowledgement, you will always be waiting. Vindication rooted in truth, however, does not rely on remembrance. It relies on alignment. When your life aligns with what is true, correction happens organically, often without formal announcement.